just to have this opportunity just to kind of get to be a part of this community for a week. And Lord, I just thank you for the fact that you love us so much, that in your relationship that you actually called us into that same relationship. And I just pray that we would recognize what it means to love you well. And then today, as we kind of move into what does it look like to love our neighbor well, I just pray that you would help us to care for each other well. I pray that we would be able to participate and teach us something. In your name, amen. As I just dropped my little clip here. All right. So yesterday, we talked about the greatest commandment, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the first and the greatest commandment. And so we talked about the idea of God as a relational God, that as we are imaged people, that he made us in his image. Part of that is that God is relationship himself, Father, Son, and Spirit. And so when we are made to be imaged people, we're made actually to be in relationship. We're made to not be alone. We also talked about the idea of what does it look like to approach Jesus, to drop sort of our masks and not allow shame to keep us from approaching sort of the throne of grace as Jesus says, come, like I want you to approach me. And recognize that he identifies with us in everything. And actually that he can even identify with us in the temptation of sin. And he took that temptation all the way to the cross, that struggle, and he didn't actually fall to the struggle. He took it all the way to the cross and died for us. So he's the perfect advocate for us as we looked at that passage. We're going to move into a kind of a new, we're kind of moving to the second part of this passage today. And it's the second commandment is love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. And I want to start with a story. A few years ago, I think I mentioned that I run a commercial fishing boat up in Alaska. I've been doing that. I was in college, needed to figure out a way to make some money and pay for school because, as you guys know, school is really expensive. And so I went up there when I was just new freshman in high school or in college. Got a job on a boat and started just grunt labor as a crewman working. And I've been doing that now. This will be my 25th year. I own my own boat now and run it. And a few years ago, we were fishing. And it seemed to be a pretty good day. Fish were hitting really hard. We were just catching tons of fish. I use nets. So we fish and we use these nets, spread them out. They're called gill nets. They got kind of a diamond. Salmon swim in, they get their gills caught, and then we have to spend time picking the fish out, and then we go deliver them and hopefully get a good paycheck. And this one particular day, it started out pretty calm. Fish were coming in. It was pretty good. It was pretty steady. And then all of a sudden, the wind started picking up. And if you know anything about fishing, fish move with the wind, which was shocking to me. I don't know how wind moves fish when fish are underwater and wind is above water. But part of it is that it churns up the water so the oxygen level in the water goes up. And so the fish are able to swim faster. They have more energy. And the salmon in Alaska are swimming. They're spawning to get up into the lakes. And so, that's when they really start pushing up the river, when the wind starts blowing and the waves start coming. And so this particular day, it started getting really stormy. And as a captain of a boat, it's not my favorite time to be fishing because it's super stressful and gets kind of scary sometimes. But we were killing it. We were catching a ton of fish. And I had full nets. And it was really exciting. And I was sitting with my crewmen. We're listening to music, and we're just kind of in a jam, trying to, we're rocking because it's pretty crazy. And I look across the boat, and I'm on one side of the net with my back sort of to this way, and my crewmen are both on this side, and we're just working the net with the fish. And all of a sudden, their eyes just get super big. And all of a sudden, they go, oh, crap. But they didn't say crap. They said something else. And I'm like, they just look like ghosts. And I turn around, and there's this boat that we can see just probably about 300 yards away, and it just goes up on its kilt and then just starts going down. And I just see this guy scrambling and then just jumps off of the boat, and his boat sinks. And so it was kind of one of those freak out moments. I'm like, what do we do? We got nets full of fish, but first priority when you're fishing is you care for each other. And so it was kind of got on the radio, yelled Mayday. And we were first, there was no one else around, so we cruised and we grabbed this guy who's, in the water trying to stay up, and we pull him into the boat. His gear is going everywhere, fuel barrels. He had a whole net plugged full of fish, and it's just kind of floating. And he's terrified. and his name was Chris. And we pull him onto the boat, and he's just, he's shaking, his adrenaline's kind of going because he wasn't prepared. He didn't have a life vest on, and he would have drowned, and he knew that. And so he was just thanking us. He tries to pull a pack of cigarettes out of his pocket, which, of course, he's been in the water, so they're soaking wet, and he's sitting here trying to light a cigarette. I'm like, dude, bro, that's not going to light. And so I'm like, but the first question I asked him was like, dude, what are you doing? Like, I was kind of panicking because I'm like, where's your crew? Because there was nobody else with him. He was just by himself. And I'm like, where's everybody else? Like, where is everybody else? Is anybody trapped under the boat? And he's like, no, I'm good, man, I'm good. I'm by myself. I'm like, you're by yourself? Like, what do you mean? He's like, we had too much weight on board. The wind started blowing. It started getting stormy, and so there was another boat that was traveling with us, and he was close to the harbor where we dock our boats. And he's like, so I put him on another boat to get weight off of the boat, and so I'm the only one on the boat. I was going by myself. And I was like, dude, you're by yourself? Where is the other boat? And he's like, well, we were so close to the harbor that they went on without me, and they thought I was going to be all right, which obviously he wasn't. And in that moment, kind of we took him to shore, dropped him off, so that he was safe, and then we obviously had to get back to our nets because we had loads of fish. But in our boat, I looked down and I saw this glove, and this is the glove that he actually left this. He had stripped all of his clothes off in the boat because he was cold, and he left this liner. This is called a glove liner. We put this underneath our rubber gloves. Kind of protects your hands and keeps them a little bit more warm. And I've kept this because in that moment, it was just this amazing illustration to me of how we were not created to journey alone. We are not created to be alone, and we're not created to face the storms and the waves of life alone, and how often we think that we can do it on our own. How often we think that, oh, okay, I'm doing great. I don't need anybody else. And the reality is, like, it's great when seas are calm. It's great when life is calm and things are going great. But inevitably, something always happens, that the storms of life always show up. And when we think we can do it alone, the reality is, like, something happens, and then we're tanked. We're by ourselves. And like that guy would have drowned had we not been there. The same thing, like, we need each other. And I think that's part of when we think about this passage, when God says that he has made us in his image, that he's made us to be relational, that we were made not to journey through life alone. And I say that and I talk about that because, and I really appreciate, Dana, thank you so much for your testimony this morning. Like, when we think about loving our neighbor and the reality of life, like, pain is a common denominator. So you heard that in Dana's story. The reality of some of the pain that she's gone through. And all of us have pain, right? Like, all of us, it's different. It looks different. But pain is a common denominator. It doesn't matter whether you're a non-believer. It's not like if you become a Christian, everything is perfect and everything goes great. Like, that's not the reality of how life works. Like, pain is something that comes up all the time. And the reality is that our wounds and our pain, it's really hard to heal on your own. We need Christ's love. We need God to heal us. And yet we recognize that he also calls us to walk with each other and to help each other in our wounds. And so that's what we're going to look at today. And I want to ask you a question, who is your neighbor? Like, when the Bible says, like, when this passage says love your neighbor as yourself, like, who's our neighbor? What do you guys think? Everyone? Is she right? Why? Why do you think that? Any thoughts? I had this conversation with my kids this morning. Because my cousin was like, or my daughter this morning, my kids were fighting, as they always do. And so we started having this conversation around, I asked them the question, like, why do you guys say things that hurt each other? And they didn't have a great answer for me. And I said, well, we're going to talk in class this morning about what it means to love your neighbor. And my daughter says, well, but Sarah lives next door, and I see her in the hallway. And I'm like, well, do you think there's no neighbors in this room? Because you're absolutely right. Like, our neighbors are everyone. Your neighbors are each other in this room. It's not just the people that are outside of the people that are a part of our group. Our neighbors, it's everyone. But there's a Bible passage that actually really goes into this and answers the question for us. And so let's stand, and I'll read it for us. But is this easy enough to read from where you're standing? Would someone be willing to read this story for us? Let's stand together and let's read this. Would somebody volunteer to read this passage? If you want to read it out of your own Bible, that's great. You can follow along. Cameron, it looks like you've got it. Are you willing to read it for us? Yep. Thank you. All right, you can sit down. So our neighbor, it's not even just everybody. I love that the example that Jesus gives, it's the quintessential example that Jesus gives is actually an abuse victim. It's somebody that's been extremely abused and somebody who's been very hurt. So it's not just like, oh, I care about the people that live near me. I care about the people in my own community. But actually, like, I care about people that have been really hurt and really wounded. And that the example that Jesus gives here is an actual abuse victim. It's somebody that actually has been traumatized and hurt by these robbers. So we're going to look a little bit more in this passage. I actually cut this down, but I actually want you to just sit with maybe a couple people next to you. So if you're at a table with 3, if you've got 4, maybe just the person next to you. I want you to look through this passage, take 3-4 minutes right now, and I want you to, how does the Good Samaritan respond to the abuse victim in the story? I want you to just kind of take note. What are the observations that you make? When you kind of examine this passage, how many things can you identify that are happening in this passage? So again, how does the Good Samaritan respond to the abuse victim in this story? Okay, take 2 to 3 minutes, talk about it, make some lists, and then I'll ask you, we'll write them down on the board here. All right. Let's start making a list. What'd you see? What did you observe? How did the Good Samaritan respond? Compassion. Okay. How else? What did you see happening? So he sacrificed what? Good. What else?
Made him feel safe by taking him off the road, and he was very vulnerable there.
Okay. He helped him feel safe. Took him off the road. What else?
He provided for him, the inn and paid for it.
He provided for him. Okay.
He even said he would come back.
Ooh. All right. He's going to follow up. Okay. Any other thoughts? It's all right if there's not.
He I guess before I said this, he spent money,
Mm-hmm.
expensive things for a guy.
He took on expenses. Oh. Used his own things. Good. All right, well let's dive in a little bit on what's actually happening here. So one thing I want to ask first off before we just jump into that, what's this? This is a Jewish man, right? A Jewish man that gets attacked by robbers on the road. And then the guy that comes in and helps him is a Samaritan. What's the difference between a Samaritan and a Jew? Yeah. Where they worship is the biggest thing. So that's a big part of it. Can you unpack that a little bit? What do you mean by that? Mm-hmm. Okay. Why do they do that?
I think it was because the mountain was where they got food and so that's where they chose to worship.
Okay. Good. It's close. What happened is when the Israelites, when they got captured, and they were sent to Babylon, so the Israelites are taken away from their lands, and the Babylonians come, they attack, and they take them back to Babylon. But some of the Jewish people were sick, they were elderly, they didn't have the energy or the ability to take it, to go all the way to Babylon, and so they stayed, they left them there in Israel. And so the Jewish people got removed, and then some of the Jews had to stay because they were elderly, they were sick, maybe they were too young to make the journey, and then there were some priests that stayed to care for those people. Well, they were in Babylon for a long time, and so those that stayed, what ended up happening is they ended up marrying and kind of intermarrying with Babylonians. So there were people that were living in the land. I mean, we're talking about years and years and years. So if there were little kids that stayed behind, or if there were people that were sick, there were people they ended up actually marrying some of the Babylons, and they mixed their culture. And so that's why they are called Samaritans. And when the Jews came back from Babylon, they looked at these people and they said, what are you doing? You married people that are not they're not Israelites? How dare you do that? These aren't Jewish people. And so Samaritans were looked at as kind of crossbreeds. And the Jews hated the Samaritans. There was actually a really big rift in action. The Jews would not allow Samaritans to worship at the temple. And so that's why they had to build their own temple to serve the Lord and to go and do their sacrifices, because they weren't allowed. The Jews did not like Samaritans. And so there was a big rift. In fact, Samaritans were treated really poorly by the Jews, which is interesting when in John 4, when you see Jesus, when he goes and talks with the Samaritan woman at the well, part of that story that's so fascinating is that actually a lot of Jews would cross the river and they would go around, rather than going through Samaria, they would actually spend an extra few days and go around, just so that they didn't go through Samaritan land, because they didn't want to become unclean, that they didn't want to interact with the Samaritans. And that's part of that story, is why it's so fascinating. Is Jesus, he actually goes straight through Samaria with his disciples, and then he sits and talks with a Samaritan woman, which would have been so, if you were Jewish, especially if you were in the law, especially if you would never interact with a Samaritan in general, let alone a Samaritan woman. So Jesus really crossed a lot of cultural boundaries when he reached out to her. It was a significant thing. So in this story, we see that the man that gets robbed, he's a Jewish man, and the Samaritan is the one who actually comes and rescues him, who helps him. So let's walk through this passage a little bit. What's happening here? Well, there's 12 Greek verbs. If you're kind of a Bible nerd, there's 12 Greek verbs that he uses here to describe 8 different actions, 8 different ways that he responded. So the first one is that he saw. So he saw the man. He didn't pretend that he didn't see the man suffering. He didn't shut his eyes. He let it sink in, and he really saw him. He saw him sitting there. And he's wounded. And I think it's really important to recognize in our own lives, how often do we pretend that we don't see people suffering? Like, have you ever caught yourself doing that? Homeless guy, side of the road, he stinks. We had a guy living in front of our house for 2 months last year with his shopping cart, screaming. Poor guy, schizophrenic, and he would scream to high heavens, cussing and swearing. My wife and kids were always scared, didn't want to go out front of our house. I live in Portland, Oregon, so we're not allowed to kick them out. The police won't do anything about it. It's public land, they can be there. And so he lived in front of our house with his shopping cart for 2 months. I had to have some interesting conversations with him because sometimes he would take his clothes off, and I'm like, you can't expose yourself in front of my kids, and I appreciate it if you didn't, cuss all night long yelling. So we had some interesting interactions. Poor guy, he had a hard time communicating because he was struggling with schizophrenia. But the reality is it's easy sometimes. It's one thing to just kind of go through our life, but to actually see people. And the Samaritan man, he actually saw the man laying on the ground, abused and broken, right? So he had the eyes to see him. And I think I really want to challenge us when we think about loving our neighbors. Do we see the people that are suffering around us? And sometimes it's very obvious situations like that, where it's like, oh, there's a homeless person, or there's somebody here that's like, I just don't want to, I want to pretend that I don't see that situation happening because I don't want to interact with them. Sometimes, honestly, it's in our own communities, where we see people in our own, even in a community like this, where you see people and you know that they're hurting, and it feels like, oh man, this is like, if I acknowledge that I see it, then I feel like I have to do something about it. So I'm going to pretend like I don't see what's happening here. So I think it's important to recognize that he saw the man. The second one, he had compassion. So we caught that one here. The Greek word used here as compassion is, and I'm not good at this. Anybody know how to say this? Splagchnizomai. Not good for me. Anybody know how to pronounce that properly? I don't. But that's what the Greek word is for, splagchnizomai. However you say that. It literally means to have your bowels churning. In this sense, compassion is a costly response to the suffering of others. It's empathetically and emotionally expensive. You actively and cognitively choose to suffer alongside the hurting. And have you ever been in a place where you see somebody suffering and you literally feel it like in your gut? It's like it's like, oh my goodness, there's nothing, I just can't stop thinking about it. I can't believe that this happened. And you're just kind of, your guts are churning. That's what it means to truly have compassion. But it's emotionally costly. Have you heard the term compassion fatigue? Has anyone ever heard that term before? So I walked for years and years and years with a recovery community. Had to bury a lot of people from addictions, overdoses, spent hours sitting with people who had been sexually abused, all sorts of crazy situations. And so many times I would go home at night and I just couldn't stop thinking about it. I just felt so much compassion because I loved these people. I got to know their names. I got to know their stories. Some of them were people that, I had one transgender person who would come and meet with me every week. She used to come and meet with me and talk about, her tithes and confess that she spent her tithe money on poker games, different things like that. But I really got to know Christy really well, and I had compassion for her. We would sit and talk about Jesus. We would talk about these kind of things. And in that sense, but over time, there's a reality that it is costly to feel that deeply for people that are in pain, that are hurting. And that's what we see here. He had compassion, that he had that churning in his guts for the person that was suffering. And so he was compelled. He had to go do something about it. Third thing we see here, he went to him. This is directly contrasted with the two religious leaders who upon seeing the man, walked away from him on the far side of the road. There's two kinds of injustice here. So, we have these two, that we have a Levite and we have a priest. And you think, if you're like somebody who truly loves God, if you're following the great commandment of love your neighbor as yourself, you think if anybody's going to go and help this man, it's going to be the pastor. It's going to be the priest. It's going to be the person that claims to be following God the way that they're supposed to. And yet, what do? They don't go to him at all. They actually cross to the other side of the road, pretend they don't see him, and they just keep walking on by. So the reality is, like, he went to him. He didn't just kind of avoid him. He didn't kind of walk to the other side. Maybe if somebody notices and calls me out, I'll be like, oh, I didn't even see that guy. Like, I was over here. The reality is, like, he didn't. He went to the man. And I think that sometimes we can have compassion for people, and yet we don't actually do anything about it. And how many times have I'm guilty of this too. I'll come home and I'll tell Daisha, like, oh man, I saw this guy today. He was hurting so bad. It was just so crazy, the world that we live in today. And she'll be like, well, yeah, what did he say? I'm like, I didn't really talk to him. I didn't actually go to him. I didn't go and try to have a conversation with him because I was busy or I had other things going on, or I just was afraid that he'd take up too much of my time, or he probably wouldn't understand what I was saying anyway. I could tell he's schizophrenic. But the reality is, like, this is not what happened here. He went to him. He didn't avoid him. And just as the other two religious leaders who were on their way didn't want to get near him. And so they avoided him. They didn't go to him. Fourth thing, he bandaged up his wounds. This would have required direct contact with this wounded man, potentially getting dirty, getting bloody, and becoming religious or ritually unclean had the man died in the process. So in the law, obviously the Jews followed the law, tried to as much as they possibly could. Of course, they never were perfect with that, which is why we needed Jesus. That's why he confronted them so often, like, you hypocrites. But the reality is, like, say they touched him, say they moved him, whatever, he died, they would be ritually unclean, and therefore they couldn't go and worship in the temple. And so they avoided the man because they had their own agenda. They had their own things that were going on. But that's not what he did. He went and bandaged his wounds. And I think sometimes we can fly through these stories really quick and not really consider what that would have been like. I mean, this isn't a guy that just like fell off his horse or just kind of tripped on something. He got attacked by robbers. Like he got the crap kicked out of him. It says he was half dead. Like somebody who's half dead is most likely unconscious. They're probably completely bloody. They got a lot going on, and he goes and helps the man. He bandages his wounds. He takes him. He probably had to roll him over. He's getting bloody himself. He's getting dirty. And this is why I love the way that Jesus uses this as an example. I think someday, when I get to heaven, one of the things that I'm looking forward to do is actually looking at Jesus' hands. And not just because of the holes in his hands, because I think that he's going to have dirt under his fingernails. Jesus got in with people, and he walked with them, and he helped them. And he was not afraid of the messiness of the life of walking with his neighbor and helping people and walking, like really, really embracing people. And this man, this Samaritan man, he was not afraid of that. He allowed himself to probably get bloody and to get dirty. He was not afraid of the fact that, I could become ritually unclean. It wasn't in it for him. He cared so much. His compassion drove him to go to the man and to help bandage his wounds. Next one. He anointed him with oil and wine, which was an ancient Jewish medical treatment for wounds. Which is interesting to me because I'm going, all right, you're traveling, like why would you carry like wine and oil with you? And I think there's something in my own mind. I'm not saying that the passage is necessarily saying this, but I think when we are trying to walk with wounded people, have we prepared ourselves? Are we prepared to help the people that we're going to encounter? And he had what he needed. He had the bandages, he had oil and wine, which were costly, and yet he used this for this man who was an enemy, somebody who actually treated him poorly, and he used his own things. So he provided for him, he took on expenses, used his own things. He used his own things to help somebody who probably would have spit at him if he was conscious, who would have mocked him if he was conscious, and yet he didn't care about that because he was so moved and he wanted to help this man. He wanted to help this neighbor, right? He loaded him on his donkey. This is one that I had never thought about. This would have required great physical exertion. The wounded man must have been hard to lift on his horse in his condition. Furthermore, this required the Samaritan to walk while the wounded man rode the donkey. This action also involved risk. What if the Samaritan had dropped him? What if in his vulnerable position, the robbers had returned while the Samaritan was on foot? Have you ever tried to lift anybody that's unconscious and put them like up on a table by yourself? Like you have. Well, I have not. But I've tried to lift my kids sometimes. As they get bigger, it gets harder and harder all the time, and they're not full-grown adults. Imagine trying to lift somebody who's unconscious, most likely, can't help himself up. He had to lift him and put him on top of his donkey. That must have taken an incredible amount of physical exertion. And then you're always going, okay, like I hope that this Jewish guy doesn't wake up and, he may start yelling at me, get away from me, Samaritan. There's the possibility that actually he might drop him and he might get more hurt. And yet he takes the risk. He's willing to risk, and he doesn't use risk as an excuse. And I think sometimes that's often the case. We use sort of risk as an excuse. How many times have I had people say to me, I love that you're caring for these people, but hey, be careful. My mom used to always say that to me. Like, hey, I know you're working with some of these addicts and things, sweetheart, and I think it's really beautiful that you're doing that, but just, be careful. Not only because I don't want you, I know your story and I don't want you to be tempted by them. Like, yeah, it's a risk. There's risk involved with helping people. And so often I hear people saying things like that. This is similar to, I told you I ran a skateboard ministry for a long time. And in the church, you know what the number one complaint was about the ministry that we were doing? It was a lot of the women in the church that were going, our dishes are getting really dusty in the kitchen because we had skateboard ramps in the basement. And when the kids would skate, they'd come in, they're smoking in the parking lot, they'd leave cigarettes, butts all around. And people in the church are going, we might have to cancel this ministry. It's really like costing us as a church. And it's kind of risky having all these kids just running around the building. What if they steal things? They're in the building. Sometimes they're not supervised. And what if they steal some of our audio equipment? There's always an excuse. But caring for people, sometimes it takes risk. And this Samaritan man risked a lot to help this man. Next one. He took the wounded man to the inn. The Samaritan's personal agenda, his schedule, and resources have been completely rerouted and reappropriated, right? So he was going somewhere. He was traveling. He was meeting somebody, who knows what was happening, but he didn't care about his agenda. He didn't care about all those other things that he could have used as excuses, like, man, I would really love to help this guy. Man, I feel for him. I feel the compassion. It's too bad I'm meeting, my friend for lunch. Otherwise, I'd totally be able to spend some time with him and maybe help this guy out. Hopefully somebody else will come along and help him. The reality is, like, he put his agenda aside. I can imagine that those other Jewish priests, they were hurrying, they were on their way to get somewhere, and they were like, maybe they actually did want to help the man, but they're going, yeah, I can't take the time to do this. I'm sure somebody else will come along, but I've just got too much going on right now. But he doesn't do that, does he? He takes his personal agenda, his schedule, and his resources completely rerouted and reappropriated. He probably had a reason why he was carrying some of the things that he was carrying, and he reappropriated them for a man who was his enemy to care well for him. Can't forget these kind of things. I think it's really significant. Next one. He cared for him. The initial medical care involved in bandaging and anointing his wounds weren't enough to heal his wounds. More care was required, and more care was sacrificially given. So he took the man to the inn because he recognized, like, hey, I'm not going to be able to stay with this man. Probably it's going to take weeks for this man to heal, and I may not have the time, so I'm going to care for him. I'm going to take him to an inn where somebody else can watch him and care for him well as he heals. It's going to take time for this man to be well enough to, if he was half dead, it's going to take a while for this person to be able to get on their feet again and to get on with their life. And so more care was required, and he sacrificially gave so that this person could be cared for. He took out and gave 2 silver coins to pay for 2 months at the inn, with a promise for more money should it be needed. So he gave money to the innkeeper, said, take care of this person. And then I also, like, if I'm going to come back, and if there's more, like, I'll pay more. The severe condition of this man. It says these 2 silver coins would have paid for about 2 months' stay at an ancient inn, indicating the severe condition of this man. So the reality is, like, the money that he spent, the wages, would have been about a full day's wage for somebody if they were. So it's probably a significant amount of money. And he gave that money and said, hey, here's 2 silver coins. This will be able to care for him. He will be able to stay here for about 2 months. Care well for him, and I'm going to come back, you know. Let's look at this one. Oh, he does. Oh, I'll go backwards here. Oh, great. There, I got through my, see, I went too far. Yeah, so he took out, and he says, I'm going to come back. If there's more money that I owe you, I'm willing to pay it. Would you mind caring for this man? I can't sit here for 2 months and care for him. But I want to make sure that he's taken care of. And if there's more expenses that you occur during that time, I am gladly willing to pay for them. I'm going to come back. Somebody mentioned that. I'm going to come back and I will pay whatever it costs, the extra care. So when this passage is talking about loving our neighbor, I think we have to hold the weight of that, of what is this actually calling us to. Jesus closes this account with a clear as day command. Go and do likewise. So it's not like this is optional. You know, it's not like we get to go, oh, yeah, love God, love our neighbors. That's the greatest commandment. But it's sometimes we take this lightly. This is a command from Jesus. He says, go and do likewise. He's asking us to pay attention to the world that we live in and the people that are hurting, and are we willing to approach them? Are we willing to go to them and take care of them, to walk with them, even if there are enemies, even if there are people that treat us poorly? And actually, that's sometimes the thing that makes the greatest difference, is to care for people well that way. So as we endeavor to go and care for hurting people, we will soon discover that this ministry will cost us. Physically, spiritually, emotionally, psychologically, just as it cost the Good Samaritan to care for the abused Jewish man. Caring for our neighbor is costly. Caring for hurting people is costly. It takes time. You can have compassion fatigue. It can take a lot out of you. It can cost you literally money. Over the years, people have asked, sadly, when you work with addicts, that's the number one thing that you get asked all the time is, hey, can I borrow a few bucks? Sometimes it's more than a few bucks. And there's so many times when I've told myself, like, okay, can I afford this right now? Like, I don't know that I can. But the reality is, like, I'm like, all right, God, like, what am I going to use this for? I'm going to use it for something that I want. But you called me to love my neighbor and to care well for them, so I want to use that expense, and you know what? I'm not even going to ask for it back. I'm like, hey, bro, if you at any point in time want to give it back, but I don't look at it as a loan. It's like, hey, you know what? Like, pay me when you can. They never do. And the hardest part usually is that they avoid you because they know they owe you money. So that's why I just say, you know what? I care more about the relationship than the money. So the only thing that'll piss me off, I don't care if you don't pay me back, but usually I'm like, but if you avoid me because you owe me money, then I'll be pissed. Like, I want to have a relationship with you. So I'm giving you this money. If you can pay me back someday, that's great. But if not, I don't want you to owe me something because then you'll avoid me. Because that's what usually happens. The reality is, like, it's costly to do ministry. It's costly to do work. And as you guys are leaving here this year and you're starting to think through, okay, what are you calling me to? Well, I'll tell you one thing. Loving your neighbor is not optional. So however you want to live the rest of your life, whatever God's calling you to do after this, whether you're going to go to Bible college and go, I want to be a teacher, whether you're going to go, I'm just going to I want to get an occupation. I want to become an engineer. Whatever that might be, recognizing that we want to pay attention to the people that are around us because we live in community. I'm going to show you one last thing, and then we'll take a break. My buddy Scott made a video for me for when I was running this refuge community. And I really love this video. I think it really portrays the idea of how does God use our pain to help other people. We want to be wounded healers, right? So how can God take the pain that's been in our lives? I mean, you heard Dana's story. A lot of pain in her life. And yet I totally believe that God is going to use that pain as a wounded healer to help other people. And so watch this video.
Once a great ship was built. It was strong, mighty, something to behold. And it was given a great purpose, to deliver important seeds on the far side of the ocean. The ship celebrated its great purpose. It thought, how great of a task, I must be valuable. Look at this great purpose I was given. This is what I was meant to do. So it set sail. On its journey, an unforeseen storm came upon it. It thought it could handle it. It was sure it could handle it, but the storm was much bigger than it planned for. It couldn't control the situation. The ship was wiped out by the storm. It found itself wrecked on some rocks. It couldn't move. It couldn't go anywhere. The great ship was lost in the ocean. As it sat there for a long time, it sat with its failure. Its failure to fulfill its purpose. But something unforeseen happened. Slowly the water seeped into the seeds, and they began to germinate and grow. They grew and grew, and over time, there was a large forest. One day, another ship came passing by, also broken and floundering from an unforeseen storm. It came to the broken ship island and asked, "May I rest here a while? I'm so tired from my journey." The great ship replied, "Sure, by all means." As the new ship rested, the great ship gave some of its wood to build a shelter for the crew of the other ship. They stayed a while. After they rested and were healed, the new ship left renewed for its journey. "Thank you for your hospitality. You really helped me." After a while, another ship came by. That ship also asked if it could rest for a while. It had been bruised and battered in a storm too, and needed a place to be. The great ship took some more of its wood and built another shelter for the much larger crew. When it was healed, it also went on its way. This kept happening. New ship after new ship kept coming, all injured by an unforeseen storm and needing a place to be for a while. The great ship realized that it had something to give, a place to rest, and solidarity from being wrecked as well by the unforeseen storms of the great sea. Pretty soon the great ship decided to build a lighthouse so that all ships passing by that way could find a place to be cared for, to rest, and then continue on their journeys. Throughout the years, the great ship cared for many, many broken and bruised ships. This was a quizzical mystery to the great ship. Out of its own wreckage and failure, it became a gift to others. It always wondered if this was the purpose all along.
So as we think about loving our neighbor, as we think about how God is going to use us, the reality is that he's called us to love the people around us and the wounded people. And the more that you do that, the more you sacrifice. The reality is it's like that lighthouse. People start recognizing you're somebody that sees them, right? There's somebody that is not just sees them, but comes to them and is willing to sit with them and to hear their pain. And they're willing to share their stories with you. And you'll find that then all of a sudden a lot more people come. And that's what I love about this story that Jesus says loving your neighbor is an opportunity. And I've found that it's an opportunity to share the gospel with people that never would step foot in the church. Because at least Ben acknowledges that I'm here. And he sees my pain. And he's willing to sit with me and not just try to make sure that I'm doing the right things. He's not worried that I'm going to mess up his church or mess up his house. But he's willing to hear my story and walk with me. And it's been an amazing journey for myself to get to be in those spaces where now I have so many people, sometimes to my wife's pain that they call me in the middle of the night, need a ride somewhere. But the reality is, like, I'm so grateful that that's how God's used a lot of the pain in my life through my story to get to walk with others. And I hope that for you, as you do that, and as we talk about, we're going to spend the rest of the week talking about how do we live well in community and how do we lead ourselves well and how do we lead people well. All right, we'll take a break. What I would ask you to do before our next session is if you could take your notebooks, your Bibles, and maybe put them in the back. And then if there's one or two people that would be willing to help me move the room around, we're going to do something, an activity for the next session that's a little bit different.